Old woman raised two homeless boys. Decades later, they came back to free her. An elderly woman with barely enough food for herself made a choice that would echo through decades. She opened her door to two starving homeless boys. 25 years later, those same boys returned as successful men to find her locked away in a place that would shock you. What they did next will leave you speechless. This is the true story of Margaret Chin, and it proves that sometimes the smallest acts of love create the biggest miracles. Before we get deeper into this story, drop your city in the comments and make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. 72-year-old Margaret Chin lived alone in a small house on Maple Street. Her husband had died 3 years earlier, leaving her with just his pension and Social Security to survive. Margaret had worked as a seamstress her entire life, but arthritis in her hands forced her to retire early. Every dollar mattered. She counted pennies at the grocery store and wore sweaters inside to keep the heating bill low. Her children lived across the country and rarely called. But Margaret had something money couldn't buy, a heart bigger than her tiny house. On the coldest night of that winter, she heard scratching at her back door. At first, she thought it was raccoons getting into her garbage. But when she peered through the window, her breath caught in her throat. Two boys, maybe 8 and 10 years old, were huddled together behind her trash cans. They wore torn sneakers with holes that let the snow in. Their clothes were too thin for the bitter cold. The older boy had his arms wrapped around the smaller one, trying to share what little warmth they had. Margaret didn't hesitate. She opened the door. "Come inside right now," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "You'll freeze to death out there." The boys looked terrified. The older one, Marcus, stepped protectively in front of his younger brother David. They had learned not to trust adults. Too many people had hurt them before. "We're not stealing anything," Marcus said, his voice shaking from cold and fear. "We were just trying to stay warm." Margaret's heart broke. These weren't troublemakers. They were babies, lost and scared. "I know you're not stealing," she said, "but you're going to catch pneumonia. Come on." She ushered them into her small kitchen and immediately put a pot of soup on the stove. As the boys warmed up, their story came out in whispers and fragments. Their mother had died of an overdose 6 months earlier. They had no other family. The foster system had failed them twice, and they'd been living on the streets for weeks, sleeping in abandoned buildings and eating from dumpsters. Margaret made a decision that night that would define the rest of her life. She couldn't send them back to the cold streets. She just couldn't. "You can stay here tonight," Margaret told them as she made up beds on her old couch. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." But tomorrow came, and she couldn't bear to call social services. The next day stretched into a week, then a month, then years. Margaret never legally adopted Marcus and David. She couldn't afford the lawyer fees or navigate the complex system. But in every way that mattered, they became her boys, and she became their grandmother. Those early years were incredibly hard. Margaret's small pension now had to feed 3 people instead of 1. She learned to make soup stretch for 3 days and to darn socks until they were more thread than original fabric. But she also learned the joy of packing school lunches and helping with homework. She learned what it felt like to have someone run to her with scraped knees and broken hearts. Marcus and David flourished under her care. Marcus, the older boy, was naturally protective and studious. He spent hours at the kitchen table with Margaret, who taught him to read using old newspapers and library books. David was the dreamer, always drawing pictures and telling elaborate stories. Margaret made sure they went to school every day, even when money was tight. She walked them there herself when the bus fare was too much. She attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every basketball game she could afford to reach. The neighbors whispered sometimes. An old Chinese woman raising 2 black boys wasn't common in their neighborhood. But Margaret didn't care about whispers. She cared about making sure Marcus and David knew they were loved, valued, and capable of anything. As the boys grew older, Margaret's sacrifices grew bigger. When Marcus showed interest in computers, she saved for 8 months to buy him a used one from a garage sale. When David wanted art supplies, she worked extra hours, mending clothes for neighbors to afford them. She never made them feel guilty for what they cost her. Instead, She made them feel precious. "You boys are my greatest investment," she would tell them. "Someday, you're going to change the world." Margaret pushed them academically in ways their birth mother never could have. She sat with them through homework every night, even when she didn't understand the subjects. She made flashcards and quiz games. When they struggled, she found free tutoring at the local community center. Both boys excelled in school, but their paths were different. Marcus fell in love with technology and computers. He spent hours learning programming languages from library books and free online tutorials. David discovered he had a gift for art and design, creating beautiful drawings that Margaret proudly displayed on their refrigerator. By high school, both boys had earned partial scholarships. Margaret worked extra jobs to help cover what the scholarships didn't. She cleaned offices at night and took in more sewing work, her arthritic hands aching but never complaining. When college acceptance letters arrived, Margaret cried with joy. Marcus had earned a full ride to study computer science at the University of Michigan. David received a scholarship to the Art Institute of Chicago. The night before they left for college, Margaret gathered them in the living room where they had spent countless evenings. "I want you to remember something," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "You don't owe me anything. You never did. But I need you to promise me one thing. Be good men. Help others the way you've been helped. Make your lives count." Both boys promised through their tears. They thought they understood what she meant then. They had no idea how much deeper her words would become. The next 15 years transformed Marcus and David into the successful men Margaret always knew they could become. Marcus founded a tech startup that developed software for nonprofits. His company grew rapidly, and by age 30, he was worth millions. But success came with a price. The demands of running a company consumed him. 18-hour days became normal. He moved to Silicon Valley, then New York, chasing bigger deals and greater success. David became a renowned graphic designer, working with major brands and eventually opening his own agency in Los Angeles. His artwork had been featured in galleries, and celebrities sought him out for custom pieces. Like his brother, success pulled him into a whirlwind of deadlines, travel, and constant pressure. Both men sent money to Margaret regularly. They called on birthdays and holidays. But as their careers demanded more, their visits became less frequent. Margaret never complained. She was proud of what they had achieved. She lived quietly in the same small house on Maple Street, now in her 90s. Her arthritis had worsened, and walking had become difficult. She still did her own grocery shopping and maintained her independence with fierce determination. The neighborhood had changed around her. Many of the old families had moved away. New developments had sprung up, and her small house looked increasingly shabby in comparison. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Marcus was in a board meeting when his phone rang. He almost ignored it, but something made him step out to answer. "Is this Marcus Johnson?" The voice was professional, cold. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Patricia Williams from Sunset Manicare Facility. I'm calling about Margaret Chen. You're listed as her emergency contact." Marcus's world tilted. "What's wrong? Is she hurt?" "Mr. Johnson, Mrs. Chen was brought to our facility 3 weeks ago. Her house was condemned by the city, and she had nowhere else to go. We've been trying to reach you." 3 weeks. Margaret had been gone from her home for 3 weeks, and he didn't even know. Condemned? What do you mean condemned? The city declared it uninhabitable due to structural damage and code violations. Mrs. Chen couldn't afford the repairs. She's been placed in our state-funded care program. Marcus felt sick. "I need to see her immediately." Visiting hours are from 2 to 4 on weekdays only. I should mention, Mr. Johnson, that Mrs. Chen's condition has declined significantly since her arrival. Marcus hung up and immediately called David. Within hours, both men had canceled everything and were on planes to Detroit. Sunset Manor looked decent from the outside. The building was clean, the lawn was maintained, and the sign promised compassionate care for seniors. But the moment Marcus and David walked through the doors, they knew something was terribly wrong. The smell hit them first, a mixture of disinfectant, urine, and something else they couldn't identify. The hallways were dim, and the few staff members they saw looked overwhelmed and exhausted. They found Margaret in a shared room with 3 other elderly residents. The woman who had once bustled around her kitchen, creating meals from nothing, now sat motionless in a wheelchair by a small window. She had lost at least 30 pounds. Her eyes, once bright with determination and love, seemed empty. When she saw them, it took several moments before recognition flickered across her face. Marcus? David? Her voice was barely a whisper. Both men dropped to their knees beside her wheelchair. They had to fight back tears. "We're here, Grandma Margaret," David said, using the name they had called her as children. "We're here now." As they talked to her, the full horror of the situation became clear. Margaret shared a small room with 3 other residents. She had no privacy, no personal belongings except what fit in a single drawer. Meals were served at specific times, whether residents were hungry or not. Activities were limited to watching television in a common room. But worst of all was how the staff treated the residents. During their visit, Marcus and David witnessed nurses speaking to elderly patients like children, ignoring requests for help, and rushing through basic care tasks. Margaret had been brought here against her will when the city condemned her house. She had no say in the decision, no advocate to speak for her. The state had decided she needed care, and this was what they provided. "I just want to go home," Margaret whispered to them as visiting hours ended. "I just want to go home." That night, in their hotel room, Marcus and David made a plan. Marcus used his business connections to hire a private investigator and a lawyer. What they discovered was worse than they had imagined. Margaret's house had been condemned not because of legitimate safety concerns, but as part of a city redevelopment plan. The neighborhood was being rezoned for commercial use, and older residents were being pushed out through aggressive code enforcement. Margaret's house needed some repairs, but nothing that warranted condemnation. The city had refused to give her time to fix the minor issues, instead fast-tracking the condemnation process. Even more disturbing, they learned that Sunset Manor was part of a network of facilities that profited from housing state-funded residents. The more residents they housed, the more money they received from the government. They had no incentive to help people return home or find better situations. The lawyer explained that Margaret had rights, but she was too overwhelmed and confused to understand them. Many elderly residents in similar situations never had family members to advocate for them. David discovered that several other elderly residents at Sunset Manor had been placed there under similar circumstances. Their families either didn't know where they were or couldn't afford to help them. The brothers realized that Margaret's situation wasn't unique. It was part of a larger system that preyed on vulnerable elderly people. Marcus and David launched a two-front battle. First, they fought to get Margaret out of Sunset Manor. Second, they decided to take on the entire system that had put her there. Getting Margaret released proved harder than expected. The facility claimed she was too frail to live independently. The state argued that she had no suitable housing since her home was condemned. Marcus solved the housing problem by purchasing a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in a senior-friendly complex with full-time nursing care available. He had it furnished with Margaret's belongings that had been put in storage and decorated with photos from their years together. But the bureaucracy moved slowly. Forms had to be filed, assessments had to be completed, and approvals had to be obtained from multiple agencies. Meanwhile, David documented everything he saw at Sunset Manor. He secretly recorded conversations with staff members and took photos of the conditions. What he captured was evidence of systemic neglect and abuse. Marcus hired a team of lawyers to file lawsuits against the city for improper condemnation procedures and against Sunset Manor for inadequate care. He also hired advocates to work with other residents who had been placed there inappropriately. The case attracted media attention. Local news stations picked up the story of the successful businessmen fighting to free their adoptive grandmother. Soon, state investigators were looking into conditions at Sunset Manor and similar facilities. 6 months after their first visit to Sunset Manor, Marcus and David finally brought Margaret home to her new apartment. She wept when she saw the space they had created for her. Her old furniture arranged just like her house. Photos of Marcus and David from elementary school through their college graduations. Her sewing machine set up by the window where she could watch birds at a feeder David had installed. "You boys," she said through her tears. "You boys came back for me." With proper nutrition, medical care, and the will to live restored, Margaret's health improved dramatically. She gained weight, started walking with just a cane instead of a wheelchair, and her eyes regained their old sparkle. Marcus and David arranged their work schedules so one of them could visit every month. They hired a kind companion who helped Margaret with daily tasks but respected her independence. Margaret lived in that apartment for 3 more wonderful years. She gardened on her balcony, volunteered to teach sewing at the community center, and became a fierce advocate for elderly rights. When Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 96, hundreds of people attended her funeral. Former students she had helped with sewing, neighbors she had assisted over the years, and dozens of elderly people whose cases had been helped by the foundation Marcus and David established in her name. The Margaret Chin Foundation now helps elderly people fight inappropriate institutionalization and advocates for better conditions in care facilities. The legal case against Sunset Manor resulted in new state regulations and the closure of several substandard facilities. Marcus and David both made major life changes after their experience with Margaret's case. Marcus moved his company headquarters back to Detroit and now splits his time between technology and advocacy work. David opened a second design studio in Detroit and donates a significant portion of his time to creating materials for nonprofits serving the elderly. But perhaps most importantly, both men learned the lesson Margaret had been trying to teach them all along. Success means nothing if you don't use it to help others. They had sent money and made phone calls, thinking that was enough. But Margaret hadn't needed their money. She had needed their presence, their advocacy, and their willingness to fight for her when she couldn't fight for herself. Today, the Margaret Chin Foundation has helped over 2,000 elderly people remain in their homes or find appropriate care. The legal precedents set by Margaret's case have been used to fight similar situations across the country. Marcus and David established a scholarship program for children aging out of foster care, remembering their own experience of having nowhere to go. They've also created a mentorship program that pairs successful professionals with at-risk youth. Every year on the anniversary of the night Margaret first opened her door to them, Marcus and David volunteer at homeless shelters, serving meals and listening to stories. They know that every person they meet has the potential to change the world if someone just gives them a chance. Margaret's small house on Maple Street has been restored and turned into a community center that provides services for elderly residents and homeless families. A plaque by the front door reads, "Margaret Chin opened this door to 2 homeless boys in 1998. Sometimes the smallest acts of love create the biggest miracles." The ripple effects of Margaret's kindness continue to spread. The boys she saved have saved thousands of others. The love she gave freely has multiplied beyond anything she could have imagined. Margaret Chin's story proves that kindness is never wasted. When she opened her door on that cold December night, she had no idea she was setting in motion events that would touch thousands of lives. She showed us that family isn't about blood. It's about love, commitment, and showing up when it matters most. She demonstrated that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in the lives we touch and the legacy we leave. Margaret also taught us that success comes with responsibility. Marcus and David had achieved everything society says matters: money, recognition, career success. But none of it meant anything until they used it to serve someone who had served them. This story challenges us to look around our own communities. Who needs an advocate? Who needs someone to fight for them when they can't fight for themselves? Who needs someone to open a door and say, "You matter"? Margaret's legacy reminds us that we all have the power to change lives. We don't need to be wealthy or famous or powerful. We just need to be willing to see suffering and respond with love. As you think about Margaret's story, ask yourself this: what door is life asking you to open? What homeless person, literally or figuratively, is waiting in the cold outside your comfort zone? Margaret didn't have much money, but she had something more valuable. She had courage. The courage to act when action was needed. The courage to love when love was risky. The courage to invest everything she had in 2 boys whose society had written off. That courage changed everything. What would happen if you found that same courage? What would happen if you opened your door to someone who needs help? What would happen if you used whatever success you've achieved to lift up someone who is struggling? Margaret's story isn't just about the past. It's a challenge for the future. It's a reminder that each of us has the power to create miracles through simple acts of love. The question isn't whether you have enough to help someone else. The question is whether you have enough courage to try. What do you think about Margaret's incredible story? Does it inspire you to look for ways to help others in your own community? Her simple act of opening a door changed everything, not just for two homeless boys, but for thousands of people whose lives have been touched by the ripple effect of her kindness. If stories like this one move and inspire you, make sure to subscribe to Beyond Yesterday for more incredible true stories that prove love and kindness can change the world. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story that might change your perspective on what's possible when we choose to care for each other. Thanks for listening, and remember, you never know when opening your door might be the beginning of a miracle.